Abilene, Texas, 1883. A place where dust settled on dreams as quickly as it did on the dry earth. The sun hung heavy over the horizon, turning the sky a pale, merciless blue. On the rickety porch of the town's only boarding house stood Rose Harper, a young widow draped in black. Her dress fluttered in the prairie wind, and her eyes, though calm, held the dull sheen of someone who had seen more loss than she could bear. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, inside a smoky saloon at the end of Main Street, her life was being wagered away with the turn of a card. Inside Dusty's saloon, laughter and whiskey filled the air thick as gunpowder smoke. Men leaned over their hands of poker, betting money, horses, and pride. Jeb Callahan, a tall, broad-shouldered rancher with sunburnt skin and a cold stare, slammed his empty whiskey glass on the table. "I'll marry the fat widow Harper," he declared, "for 50 acres and that new stallion of yours, Matthews." The men around the table howled with laughter. No one believed he'd actually do it. But 3 days later, a minister stood on that same porch beside Rose Harper. The marriage certificate was signed with shaky ink. Rose's eyes glistened, not from tears, but from quiet determination. She didn't need to be told what the town thought of her. She'd heard the whispers and cruel jokes. But survival was something she understood better than most. Sheriff Grant Lawson watched the newlyweds ride out of town, his jaw tight with disapproval. "God help you, Callahan," he muttered. "You've no idea what you just brought home." The betting book at the saloon already had odds. 10 to 1 that Rose wouldn't last a month at the Callahan ranch. The road stretched long and dusty before them. Neither Jeb nor Rose spoke as the wagon rolled toward the horizon. The Callahan ranch rose like a ghost from the plains, a 2-story house weathered by sun and wind, standing lonely against miles of brown grass. When they arrived, Jeb climbed down without a word. "Your room's at the end of the hall," he said flatly. "Breakfast at dawn, dinner at sundown. The rest's up to you." Then he walked off, leaving her standing in the doorway of her new life. Inside, the house was clean but barren. No curtains, no warmth, only walls that echoed with silence. Rose sat at the kitchen table that night, staring at the pantry's meager shelves. There was no welcome here, no kindness, but she had known coldness before. She had survived a husband's gambling debts, a town's scorn, and the slow suffocation of widowhood. She wasn't about to break now. At dawn, the rooster crowed. Jeb's boots thudded across the porch as he headed to the barn. Rose rolled up her sleeves and went to work. By the time he returned, the kitchen smelled of fresh biscuits, bacon, and coffee. Jeb sat down without a word, ate in silence, then left his plate clean before walking out again. He didn't say thank you, but Rose didn't need him to. She'd seen his surprise in the small lift of his brow. By the week's end, she'd scrubbed the kitchen clean, mended 2 curtains from scraps of old fabric, and started keeping a small journal at night. Her hands were blistered, but her resolve hardened. The ranch hands eyed her cautiously, not knowing what to make of the boss's new wife. Hank, the oldest among them, finally tipped his hat. "Morning, Mrs. Callahan," he said gruffly. The title sounded strange to her ears, but something in her straightened at hearing it. On Sunday, Rose dressed in her best black gown and waited by the wagon, Bible in hand. "Town's 15 miles, Jeb grumbled. "Church ain't part of our arrangement." But when she climbed onto the wagon herself and took the reins, he had no choice but to follow or let her go alone. Every eye in Abilene turned as Rose entered the little white church. Whispers trailed behind her like shadows. The Reverend's sermon that morning spoke of holy vows and the weight of promises. Each pointed glance her way reminded her that the town saw her marriage as a joke. But Rose didn't lower her head. She sat tall, her gaze fixed straight ahead. After the service, the women gathered outside, their laughter dying as Rose approached. Mrs. Matthews, wife of Luther, the man who had made the cruel bet with Jeb, lifted her skirt slightly, as if afraid of brushing against Rose's dress. Rose met her stare with quiet calm. Her younger sister Nellie broke from the group, hugging her tightly. "You look well," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, though worry clouded her eyes. "Don't let him break you, Rose." Rose just smiled faintly. "He won't," she whispered back. At the general store, conversations halted as she entered. Mr. Henderson, the shopkeeper, handed her supplies with a forced politeness. "Good day, Mrs. Callahan," he said stiffly. Rose thanked him kindly, lifting her chin a little higher as she walked out. Sheriff Lawson stopped her by the wagon. "How are things at the ranch, ma'am?" His voice held real concern. "Jeb can be a hard man." Rose smiled softly. "We have an understanding, Sheriff. I'm exactly where I choose to be." That week, she discovered the North Pasture. Dry, cracked, and forgotten. Most would have called it dead, but Rose saw potential. That evening, as Jeb sat on the porch with his whiskey, she stood beside him. "That land could be saved," she said. "Clover fixes nitrogen. My father used it back in Missouri." Jeb turned to look at her, surprised. "Your father taught you farming?" "He had no sons," she answered simply. "He taught me everything." The next morning, a small plot was marked off in the North Pasture. A bag of clover seed waited on the porch. Jeb didn't say a word, but she didn't need him to. His silence was permission enough. As she worked the soil under the wide Texas sky, the ranch hands stopped to watch. The fat widow who was supposed to run back to town was out here, sleeves rolled, singing softly as she turned the earth with her bare hands. And somewhere behind her, Jeb Callahan, the man who had married her for a bet, stood in the doorway, watching quietly, a flicker of something unfamiliar in his eyes. Something like respect. By the 6th week, green shoots covered the North Pasture. The soil that had once been dry and lifeless now glimmered with a soft carpet of clover. Each dawn, Rose walked the rows, her skirts brushing against the young plants, her face glowing with pride. The ranch hands greeted her differently now, not as a joke or a burden, but with nods of quiet respect. Even Jeb began to notice the change. He no longer ate in silence, though his words were few. Sometimes he'd linger on the porch when she worked late in the garden, watching her in the fading light, the sound of her soft singing drifting across the dry land. But Abilene hadn't forgotten the cruel bet that had started it all. Luther Matthews, who had made that wager with Jeb, smirked when word reached him about Rose's little farming game. "Playing at being a farmer now, is she?" he sneered in the general store. "Bet that fat wife of yours will quit before the first sprouts even show." The laughter died when Jeb stepped forward and grabbed him by the collar. "Mrs. Callahan's name doesn't belong in your mouth," he said coldly. His grip tightened. "Keep it that way." No one in town laughed after that. As the summer deepened, the Texas heat grew merciless. The creek that fed the ranch shrank each day, its banks cracking under the relentless sun. One evening, Rose found Jeb standing by the stream, his boots sunk in the dry mud. "Last time it was this bad," he said quietly. "We lost half the herd." His voice carried no pride, only worry. Rose stepped beside him. "My father used to dig basins above the fields," she said, "caught the rain before it ran off, saved our crops more than once." Jeb looked at her thoughtfully. "Maybe you ought to draw me a plan." For the first time, she saw it. Not just respect, but trust. They worked side by side for days, digging and shoveling until their hands blistered. The men followed her instructions without question. Even Hank, who had once doubted her, started calling her Mrs. C with quiet affection. Then one evening, Rose returned to the house to find a small wooden box on the kitchen table. Inside was a silver locket with 2 tiny portraits, a young woman and a small boy. When Jeb came in, his voice was rough. "My sister and her boy. Typhoid took 'em while I was away with the Rangers. Never did talk about it." Rose looked at the locket and then at him. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "You lost more than just family. You lost your peace." He met her eyes for the first time without the wall of pride. "So did you," he said. The drought worsened. Days blurred into sweat, dust, and prayers for rain that never came. One night, Jeb sat at the kitchen table, staring at the ledger. Numbers that didn't add up. The ranch was dying. Without a word, Rose sat across from him and studied the book. "Sell the east section," she said. "Petersons have been wanting to buy for months. It'll see us through until the rains come." Her calm practicality caught him off guard. "Your husband left you with nothing, didn't he?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "He did, but I survived. And so will this ranch." Before Jeb could answer, the wind shifted, bringing with it a smell that froze them both. Smoke. He rushed outside and saw it, a black cloud rising from the west. "Fire!" he shouted. Within minutes, the ranch erupted into chaos. Men filled barrels, grabbed shovels, and raced to build fire breaks. The flames tore across the plains, roaring like a living beast. "Get to town!" Jeb yelled to Rose. "Take the wagon and go," quote. But Rose didn't move. She sprinted to the cellar, emerging with jars of preserved fruit. Smashing them open, she spread the syrupy mix around the house. "Sugar burns hot, but slow," she called over the roar. "It'll make a barrier the fire can't cross." When the wind turned, trapping two young ranch hands near the barn, Rose mounted Jeb's prized stallion, the very one he'd won in the bet, and rode straight into the smoke. Jeb shouted after her, but she didn't stop. Through heat and ash, she reached the men, her voice hoarse as she guided them back through the choking haze. The flames scorched her sleeve, leaving a red mark along her arm, but she didn't slow down until the barn was clear. By midnight, the fire was beaten back. The house still stood. The north pasture still lived. And Rose Harper Callahan, covered in soot and trembling with exhaustion, had saved everything that mattered. When the dawn came, Jeb found her asleep on the porch steps, her hair tangled, her dress torn, her face streaked with ash. He stood there for a long time, watching her, the woman he had once called a bet. He finally understood the truth. He hadn't married a burden. He had married the strongest woman in Texas. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. The morning after the fire dawned quiet, the kind of silence that follows after chaos, heavy, sacred, and full of meaning. Smoke hung low over the blackened fields, but the Callahan house still stood tall. The barn was charred, yet intact. The north pasture, once dismissed as useless, shimmered green with the new clover that had survived the flames. Rose had saved it all. Word spread fast through Abilene. By the time Sheriff Lawson rode out that afternoon, the story of Rose's courage had traveled faster than wildfire. "Never seen anything like it," Hank told the sheriff proudly, wiping his soot-streaked face. Mrs. Bowe Callahan rode straight into that blaze like she was born of fire herself. Even Luther Matthews, who had once made the cruel bet, sat in Dusty's saloon speechless as the tale reached him. For the first time, he couldn't summon a joke. 3 days later, the ladies of Abilene arrived at the ranch in wagons filled with food, linens, and apologies dressed as gifts. Mrs. Peterson, the same woman who once turned Rose away from the ladies' meeting, now wrung her gloved hands and offered a brittle smile. "The Lord teaches us to help our neighbors," she said softly. Rose didn't gloat or remind them of their cruelty. She simply thanked them with dignity and served them coffee in the same kitchen where she had once eaten alone. By the time they left, even the hardest hearts among them had softened. Jeb watched all this in silence. For the first time, he saw how easily Rose commanded respect, not through anger or pride, but through grace. The same woman the town had mocked was now the one they admired most. That evening, Sheriff Lawson leaned on the corral fence beside Jeb. "A bet's just words until it's paid," he said quietly. "But a marriage, that's supposed to mean something real." His words lingered long after the sheriff rode away. That night, Jeb stood outside Rose's door for what felt like hours. Inside, she brushed her hair in the mirror, her burn healing, her eyes steady. When he finally knocked, his voice was soft. "Rose, may I come in?" She turned, surprised by the hesitation in his tone. "You may," she said. What followed wasn't the passionate scene Abilene's gossipers might have imagined. It was simple and honest. Jeb told her about his loneliness, about how pride had driven him to make a cruel wager. She told him about her late husband's debts, her humiliation, and how she had promised herself never to depend on pity. They talked until the stars began to fade. When he finally reached for her hand, it wasn't out of obligation, but out of respect, and something deeper. Something that had quietly been growing between them since the first morning she'd served him breakfast. For the first time, they shared not just a house, but a home. Months passed. The drought finally broke with a storm that swept across the plains, filling the creeks and soaking the land. The Callahan Ranch thrived. The new irrigation basins worked better than anyone expected, and word of their success spread beyond Abilene. Then came the invitation, the harvest dance, the biggest event of the year. Rose was stunned when Jeb suggested they attend. "We'll go together," he said simply. "Time folks saw what we really are." Rose spent days altering her best dress, adding lace she'd saved from her wedding gown and soft embroidery around the collar. When they walked into the dance hall, the music stopped for a moment. Every head turned. The whispers that followed were not cruel this time, but full of awe. Luther Matthews approached first, hat in hand, his voice low. "Mrs. Callahan, I owe you an apology. For the bet, for all of it." Rose smiled kindly. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Matthews. What matters is what we learn from them." Her words carried through the hall, quieting even the boldest tongues. When the music started again, Jeb held out his hand. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Callahan?" She placed her hand in his. The crowd parted, and the couple who had begun as a cruel joke glided across the floor like they belonged there all along. Weeks later, a letter arrived from her sister Nellie. Inside was news that changed everything. Their father's old business partner had repaid every debt with interest. The money was enough for Rose to leave if she wished, to start over, free from any man or memory. That evening, Jeb handed her the letter again. "You could go," he said quietly. "Start fresh somewhere else." Rose looked around the house, the curtains she had sewn, the garden she had planted, the life they had built together. "I already did," she replied softly, "right here." A year later, on the anniversary of the fire, the Callahan Ranch hosted a celebration. The women of Abilene brought food, the men brought music, and laughter filled the air. Sheriff Lawson arrived with a certificate announcing that the Callahan Ranch had won a regional award for innovative water conservation. Rose blushed as the crowd cheered. Jeb stood beside her, his hand finding hers. "You did this," he murmured. "No," she said with a gentle smile. "We did." As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in gold and crimson, the couple stood on their porch, watching the light dance over the land that had once been as barren as their hearts. Rose leaned into Jeb's shoulder. "Funny," she whispered, "how a foolish bet could bring me everything I never dared to dream of." He smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Reckon some bets are worth losing." And as the wind carried laughter across the ranch, the land thriving, the love real, it was clear that the lonely rancher and the widow no one wanted had built something far stronger than pride or wagers. They had built a life, a love forged in fire and faith.